first tried to speak English, my lips trembled. My voice was weak, uncertain, and before I even opened my mouth, I could already feel the weight of people's eyes on me. Every sound that came out felt broken, like my tongue didn't belong to the language I was trying to speak. I remember standing in a small classroom, surrounded by confident faces, trying to say something simple, but fear held my throat like an iron hand. People laughed, not because they wanted to hurt me, but because they didn't understand the storm inside me, the storm of a boy who just wanted to express, to belong, to be understood. But that day, I realized something powerful. It wasn't my mind that was weak. It was my mouth that was untrained. We spend years memorizing grammar rules, watching English videos, collecting new words like trophies, but we forget the truth. Fluency is not knowledge, it's training. Just like an athlete trains their muscles, a speaker trains their mouth. And if your mouth has never spoken freely, how can it ever move with confidence? So I began to train not just my mouth, but my soul. Every morning, I would stand in front of a cracked mirror, look into my own tired eyes, and whisper words until they stopped feeling foreign. At first, my reflection looked back at me with doubt and asked, "Who are you trying to be?" And I whispered back, "I'm trying to be me." But in English, learning English became more than learning a language. It became learning who I was. There's something deeply emotional about expressing yourself in a new voice. It's not just about speaking, it's about identity. It's about finally being able to tell your story, your pain, your dreams, in a language that once made you feel small. I remember one night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying a moment that hurt. My teacher once asked me to introduce myself, and I froze. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear it in my ears, but no words came out. That silence haunted me for years. It wasn't just silence. It was shame, fear, and helplessness mixed into one painful moment. But then, one day, something changed. I realized silence wasn't peace. It was fear pretending to be comfort. And I decided I'd rather speak with a shaking voice than stay silent for the rest of my life. That day, I made a promise to myself. Even if people laugh, even if my accent sounds strange, I will speak, because silence never made anyone fluent. So I started with just 5 minutes a day, my mouth training ritual. It wasn't about perfect grammar or fancy words. It was about movement, feeling, and flow. I would say small sentences again and again. I can speak. I am learning. I am not afraid. And with time, those simple sentences stopped being practice. They became my truth. Slowly, my voice began to change. At first, I sounded unsure, like a child learning to walk. But then, something magical happened. The words started flowing, not because I memorized them, but because my mouth finally remembered how they felt. I wasn't translating anymore. I was expressing. And that moment, that first time, I spoke without fear. It felt like unlocking a door that had been closed my entire life. People think English is just a language, but for me, it became freedom. The freedom to speak pain, to share dreams, to tell the world, "This is me," without hiding behind silence. When I spoke again in front of a group, I didn't speak perfectly. My grammar wasn't flawless. My accent wasn't smooth, but my emotion was real. And real emotion always wins. Because people don't remember your mistakes. They remember how you made them feel. They remember the truth in your voice, the courage courage between your pauses, the spark in your eyes. That's fluency, not perfection, but connection. I learned that English was never about becoming like others. It was about becoming the truest version of myself. Every broken word, every wrong sentence, every time I was laughed at, all of it built the bridge between my fear and my freedom. Even now, sometimes I stutter. Sometimes I forget words, but I never forget how far I've come. Every trembling moment, every drop of sweat, every night I whispered alone, it all shaped my voice. And if you're listening to this now, and you feel that same fear I once felt, I want you to remember something. Your fear doesn't mean you're weak. It means you care. It means you have something inside you that deserves to be heard. So let your voice tremble. Let your words stumble. Let your fear exist. Because one day those shaking words will turn into power. And you'll look back and smile. Not because you became fluent, but because you finally found your voice. You finally found your voice, but the world still didn't seem ready to hear it. Every time you spoke, there were people who rolled their eyes, corrected your accent, or smiled politely as if your effort was amusing. And yet, deep inside, something stronger than pride was growing. A quiet understanding that you didn't need anyone's approval to keep going. You had already fought the hardest battle, the one with yourself. You knew what silence felt like, how it suffocated the soul, how it made dreams rot inside you. You weren't going back there, so you kept speaking, not to impress, not to prove, but to live. Each word became a heartbeat, each sentence a small act of rebellion against fear. Some days your voice was strong, confident, unstoppable. Other days it cracked, trembled, and broke into pieces. But that was okay. Even broken voices carry truth. Even trembling words have power. You learned that the strength of a voice isn't in how smooth it sounds. It's in how honest it is. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. You were sitting in a cafe, sipping cheap coffee, reading something in English, a blog maybe, or an article about people who changed their lives through learning. A woman at the next table leaned over and said, "Your English is really good." You froze. For a moment, you didn't even know how to respond. Compliments were unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, but you smiled anyway. That small sentence, simple as it was, stayed with you for days, not because someone praised you, but because it was the first time someone saw you. Not the mistakes, not the accent, but the effort. And that's when it hit you. Maybe all this time, it wasn't about being perfect. It was about being seen, being understood, being brave enough to show up. You realized something else to you. Weren't the only one fighting this invisible war. There were millions like you, scattered across the world, whispering in broken English, crying over forgotten words, hating their voices, yet still trying every single day. You began noticing them people in online classes, on YouTube, in comment sections, struggling to speak but never giving up. You saw yourself in them, and in that reflection you found purpose. You started recording small videos, talking about your journey, not because you wanted fame, but because you wanted someone, somewhere, to know they weren't alone. The first time you uploaded your story, your hands were shaking. Your voice wasn't perfect. Your camera quality was terrible, but your emotion was real, and real always reaches hearts. You didn't expect anyone to watch, but then the first comment came. "This made me cry." Then another. "I feel this so deeply." then hundreds more. You realized something powerful. You had turned your weakness into your message. The same voice that once made you feel small was now healing others. Every story you told became a mirror where people saw themselves, their fear, their shame, their hope. And that's when you understood, sometimes pain is not meant to break you. It's meant to prepare you for your purpose. Days turned into months, and you began speaking more, not just about English, but about life, struggle, and courage. Your accent was still there, but now it had become part of your identity, not something to hide. You used to hate it. Now you embraced it, because every sound carried your story, every tone held your past, every syllable your survival. You weren't trying to sound like anyone else anymore. You were just trying to sound like you, and that was enough. One evening, you were invited to a small event. Nothing fancy, just a group of learners who had followed your journey. You stood there, looking at all those faces, nervous but grateful. When you started speaking, your voice was calm, almost peaceful. There were no butterflies, no panic, just honesty. You spoke about fear, failure, and the nights you cried alone, whispering English words into the dark. You told them how you once hated the sound of your voice, but now it had become your greatest friend. When you finished, there was silence, not awkward, but emotional. People weren't clapping, they were feeling. You saw tears, and in that silence, you knew you had done something beautiful. You had touched hearts, not with perfect words, but with real ones. After the event, an old man came up to you. His English was broken, but his eyes were kind. He said, "You make me believe." I can still learn that sentence stayed in your chest for days. You realized that sometimes, just by being yourself, you give people hope. You don't need fancy words or perfect pronunciation. You just need truth. Truth travels further than any language. That night when you got home, you looked at yourself in the mirror again, the same cracked mirror from your early days. You smiled. The reflection staring back wasn't the same person. The fear in the eyes was gone. The shame had dissolved into quiet confidence. You whispered again, just like before, but this time your words had no hesitation. I can speak. I am enough. I am free. But freedom isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one, because when you finally find your voice, the world starts listening, but it also starts testing you. Suddenly, more people were watching your videos. Some praised you, but others mocked you. Your accent is weird, they said. You talk too slow. The old pain tried to crawl back. For a moment, you felt that familiar weight of doubt pressing against your chest. But then you remembered where you started. You remembered that this journey wasn't about being liked. It was about being real. You closed your eyes and took a deep breath, letting the noise fade away. You reminded yourself your voice had survived silence once. It could survive judgment now. And so you kept speaking louder, clearer, bolder, not because you wanted to prove anything, but because you had something to say, something the world needed to hear. That courage doesn't mean being fearless. Courage means speaking even when you're scared. You learned that voices don't change the world because they're perfect. They change the world because they're honest. And in that honesty, you found your strength again. You no longer spoke for approval. You spoke for connection. You spoke for every trembling soul too afraid to open their mouth. You became the voice you once needed, not flawless, but fearless. And in that moment, you understood the most powerful truth of all. The world perfect speakers. It needs brave ones. The world doesn't need perfect speakers. It needs brave ones. And brave you became, though not overnight. Every day was a quiet war between the old you who wanted to hide and the new you who wanted to shine. You learned that bravery is not a moment, it's a habit. It's the choice you make every single morning when you open your mouth, even when your heart still trembles. People began to listen to you, not because you spoke flawless English, but because your voice carried something real, something raw and human. Your words didn't sound like lessons from a textbook. They sounded like life. You talked about pain, struggle, the loneliness of learning something that makes you feel small before it makes you strong. You told the truth that many were too afraid to say, that learning a language is not just about words, it's about every video you posted was a small piece of your soul, and somehow people felt it. Comments poured in from strangers who said your voice gave them courage. Some wrote, "I was afraid to speak, but after watching you, I tried again." Others said, "I cried listening to your story, and for the first time, you understood something beautiful. Words can heal, even when they're imperfect." Then one evening, you received a message from a young girl named Anna. She said she had stopped trying to speak English because people laughed at her accent. But when she found your videos, she felt hope again. "When you speak," she wrote, "I feel like you're talking to me." You sat staring at that message for a long time, your eyes wet, your hands trembling. You never thought your pain could become someone's light. That night, you couldn't sleep. You lay awake, thinking about Anna, about all the people out there fighting silent battles with their voices. You realized that what you were doing wasn't just storytelling, it was connection. You weren't just learning to speak English anymore. You were helping others find the strength to speak their truth. You whispered to yourself, "Maybe this is what purpose feels like." The next morning, you recorded a video just for Anna, not a fancy one, not a scripted one, just your heart speaking. You said, "Don't wait to be perfect. Speak now, even if your voice shakes, because your voice matters." And when you posted it, something magical happened. It went viral. Millions of people watched, not because it was polished, but because it was pure. Your inbox flooded with messages, teachers, students, parents, all saying the same thing. "You made me believe I can start again." And in that wave of emotion, you realized how powerful truth can be when it's spoken with love. But with fame came pressure. Suddenly, people expected you to always be strong, always be inspiring. They didn't see the nights when you still doubted yourself, when you sat in silence, wondering if your story even mattered anymore. One night, you broke down. You turned off your phone, closed your laptop, and just sat in the dark. You whispered, "What if I'm not enough anymore?" But then, a memory flashed your first day, standing in that classroom, too afraid to speak. You remembered the laughter, the tears, the endless hours of practice. You realized that even in your lowest moments, you had never truly given up. You took a deep breath and said, "I'm still here. I'm still that same person, just louder now." That reminder was enough to pull you back. You began to see that bravery doesn't mean never falling. It means standing up every time you do. You started making more personal videos, not about English, but about life, about starting over, about healing. You told people it's okay to be scared, it's okay to fail, it's okay to be human, because being human is what makes your story beautiful. One of your videos was about loneliness. You said, sometimes we wait for others to understand us, but maybe the first step is understanding ourselves. That line touched millions. People wrote to you saying it changed their lives, and you realized that even though you started with English, what you were really teaching was courage. The courage to be real in a world full of masks. You became the voice that reminded people that it's okay to stumble. It's okay to cry. It's okay to not have everything figured out. One day you got invited to speak at a university, the same kind of place where you once couldn't say your own name without shaking. Standing on that stage, facing hundreds of faces waiting to hear you. Your heart raced, but not with fear, with gratitude. You started speaking, and the words flowed like music. You spoke about your journey from silence to sound, from fear to freedom. And at the end, you said, if you are afraid to speak, remember the first word is always the hardest, but it's also the most powerful. When the speech ended, the crowd stood in silence for a moment before they clapped. You saw tears again, not just theirs, but yours too. You realized you weren't just telling your story anymore. You were living proof that transformation is real. As you walked off the stage, a young boy ran up to you. He held your hand tightly and said one day, I'll speak like you. You knelt down and told him no. One day you'll speak like you, because you knew now. Everyone has their own voice, their own rhythm, their own truth, and that truth is worth hearing. That night, as you walked home, the city lights reflected in your eyes like memories of every fear you had ever faced. You smiled, knowing that all those sleepless nights, all those painful moments, had brought you here. You whispered softly to yourself, I was never learning just a language. I was learning myself. And as the wind passed by, it almost sounded like it was whispering back, keep going. That night, you wrote a line in your journal. The voice that once trembled now trembles. Hearts. You closed your notebook with a smile, knowing deep inside that this was only the beginning. Because when you finally learn to speak from your heart, the world listens, not because they understand your words, but because they feel your soul. And that's when you realized your story was no longer about English, or fear, or even success. It was about something far greater, the journey of a soul, learning how to be free, one word at a time. The journey of a soul, learning how to be free, one word at a time, doesn't end when the words finally flow. It begins there, because freedom is not a destination. It's a rhythm, a heartbeat, something you must protect every single day. After that night, you woke up with a quiet peace in your heart. You looked out the window, saw the sunrise, and smiled. The world hadn't changed. People were still rushing to work. Cars still honking. Life still moving fast. But you had changed. You no longer looked at life through fear, but through gratitude. You realized how far you'd come from that trembling boy who once stood frozen in silence. You whispered to yourself, you made it. You really did. But in your heart, you also knew this wasn't the end of your story. It was the start of a new purpose. Because the same way someone once gave you hope through their words, it was now your turn to pass it on, to become that spark for someone else lost in their own silence. Days passed, and your small videos began reaching more people than you ever imagined. Not just learners, but dreamers, broken souls, tired hearts, people searching for something real. They didn't come for lessons. They came for truth. They came because in your voice they heard pieces of their own story. You spoke not like a teacher, but like a friend who had walked through fire and still chose to smile. Your words became medicine for unseen wounds. One night, you got a message from a man in his 60s who said, "I thought I was too old to start learning, but after hearing you, I started again. I feel alive." You sat staring at that message, tears in your eyes, realizing you weren't just helping people speak English, you were helping them speak life again. That's when you understood something that no dictionary could ever teach. That real language is made of emotion, not grammar. It's not about being perfect. It's about being understood. And that's what you were finally doing, understanding and being understood. As your journey grew, the world around you began to change too. You started traveling small events, then bigger ones, from one city to another, standing on stages where you once dreamed of sitting in the audience. But each time you stepped in front of the microphone, you remembered where it all began. A broken mirror, a trembling voice, a promise whispered in the dark. Those memories kept you humble, grounded, real. Because fame can make you forget, but gratitude always brings you back. You met hundreds of people who told you how your words changed their lives. Some hugged you, some just cried silently. One woman told you she played your video every morning to remind herself that she was strong enough to face another day. You didn't know what to say. You just held her hand and whispered, "We're all learning together." And that was the truth. You weren't a hero or a teacher. You were still a learner, just one who refused to give up. But even in the brightest light, shadows exist. Some nights, you still felt empty. The pressure of always being strong sometimes crushed you. People saw your success, but not your solitude. They heard your voice, but not your silence. There were nights you looked in the mirror again, wondering if your purpose had become your prison, the weight of expectations. The endless cycle of trying to inspire it began to feel heavy. You missed the simplicity of your early days when it was just you, your fear, and your dream. So one evening, you took a long walk away from cameras, away from screens. The city lights shimmered like memories, and for the first time in a long while, you allowed yourself to cry, not from sadness, but release. You whispered to the wind, "I don't want to be perfect. I just want to be real." And in that quiet confession, something inside you healed again. You realized that even heroes need rest, even voices need silence, because silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's recovery. The next morning, you did something simple. You recorded a new video. No script, no filters, no perfect background. Just you, sitting by a window with the morning light on your face. You said, "I've learned something. The real journey isn't about learning English, or speaking perfectly, or becoming famous. The real journey is about finding peace with who you are, about speaking even when your voice shakes, about being honest even when you're scared. Because when you stop chasing perfection, you start living truth." That video became your most loved one. Millions of people watched it, not because of its quality, but because it was pure, human, and real. In a world full of filters, you had given them something rare, authenticity. As months passed, your name became known not as a teacher, but as a storyteller, someone who reminded people that every broken sentence still has meaning. You built a small community online, a family of dreamers who believed in progress, not perfection. Together, you celebrated small wins, someone's first sentence, another's first conversation, someone's first job interview. You realize that happiness doesn't live in achievements. It lives in those moments where hearts connect. One evening, as you scrolled through messages, you saw one from Anna again. "I got my first job," she wrote. "I still make mistakes, but I'm not afraid anymore. Thank you for teaching me that." You smiled softly, feeling your heart swell with pride and peace. That was your full circle moment. The student had found her voice too. You realized that's how life works. We heal, we help others heal, and in that cycle, we find meaning. Years later, you stood again on a stage, but this time it was bigger, brighter lights, thousands of people. As you took the microphone, your hands didn't shake. You looked at the crowd and said once, "I couldn't say my own name without fear. Today I stand here because I decided to speak anyway." The crowd cheered, but you weren't thinking about the noise. You were thinking about that first trembling word, that first silent night, that first spark of courage. And you smiled, knowing this truth. Sometimes, the smallest decision to speak, to try, to not give up, changes everything. You ended your speech with a line that came straight from your heart. Fluency isn't when you stop making mistakes. Fluency is when you stop being afraid to make them. As the lights dimmed and the applause echoed, you walked off stage with tears in your eyes, not tears of sadness, but of peace. You finally understood that the journey was never about learning to speak English. It was about learning to believe in yourself. It was about finding the courage to be heard. And somewhere deep inside, you knew this story would live on, not just in your words, but in every heart that once trembled with fear and now beats with confidence. You looked up at the night sky, whispered one last time, "Thank you," and smiled because the voice that once trembled had finally found its home.